Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry, and I'm joined, as always, by Brandon Tessers, LCPC. Brandon is a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy, as you say, Brandon, for oh so very many reasons.
Sometimes I throw a bunch of extra varies on there. Hi, it's good to be here.
It's good to be with you again. How are you doing this week?
Doing all right. I'm happy to be here with you and anybody who's joining us.
Yeah. So, a little bit of housekeeping. Effective Artistry is a therapy and coaching practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. Uh, there's a number of licensed therapists who can offer services to clients anywhere within the state of Illinois, and also a number of executive functioning coaches who can provide coaching services to people all around the world, as long as you have an internet connection. Um, we have a different topic that we discuss every week. We solicit topic ideas from you, the audience. And Margaret Schaus, who's one of the therapists with Effective Artistry, usually puts a call out on TikTok for suggestions for topics, ideas, and concepts you want us to cover. So if you're on TikTok, you'll find us there at Effective Artistry. We have a topic for today, and I just need to pull up some of the questions we've got on this. I'm not sure, this may have been one that you've covered before, Brandon, but I guess it's no harm to revisit some of these things. So today's topic is boundaries and people pleasing. So these are two terms I see coming up a lot on social media, um, not just in neurodivergent circles, but the I guess the term people pleasing is it's pretty broad. So I wonder maybe we can drill down into that today and talk about what it means and how it impacts
Yeah,
people.
sounds
Yeah.
fun.
Okay. So first obvious question: what is people pleasing in terms of behavior? How does it present itself?
Um, yeah, this every week I always want to talk about terms at the beginning, but it's because we keep talking about things like this where we want to talk about terms. People pleasing, obviously, as everything means different things to different people. Whatever people use it to mean is what it means for that person in that context. We are going to talk about how we find it most useful to be used. We'll also probably talk about it in terms of what we find it to most commonly kind of be used to mean, or at least some categories that are common. But by the very like basic fundamental nature of it, it just means doing things that please other people. Usually that's not something we're going to be talking about like on that basic level because, and I think it's kind of important for people to know, that is the default human pattern of behavior. That
Right.
the human species biologically in our genes, in our instincts, through evolutionary processes, we are an incredibly biddable species. We are very cooperative. We want to, by default, kind of do whatever it is that the people around us want us to do. It intrinsically and inherently feels good to feel as though the people around us like us, value us, etc. And it inherently, intrinsically, and inevitably feels bad when we feel as though those people are not happy with us, especially when we feel as though, so sometimes we'll talk about like there's positive, right, that they like us, there's neutral, they neither like nor dislike us, and there's negative, that they dislike us, that they actively would like to be away from us or cause us harm or whatever. um, so that's just how we are. And I know that's like kind of counter to a very common narrative of like man is a savage beast and et cetera, et cetera. But have you ever met a baby? Like, no, they're not savage beasts. It is really, it's biological. One of the things that makes us who we are as a species is that we have massive brains based against the like proportion of our body weight, right? Like elephants and whales have bigger brains, but as proportionate, which also means that gestation and birth, blah blah blah, in order at a certain point in evolution, in order for our brains to be able to continue to grow and the heads therefore to be able to continue to grow to hold them and protect them, humans are born before they're done cooking, I
Yeah.
guess you could say, right? Like other animals will be born walking right away or ready to hunt or whatever right away. Humans are completely incapable of when they're being born. In fact, it's so much like right up to the wire that if babies are born 2 weeks, 3, 4 weeks, sometimes even a few days before that like 40-week gestation period, their lungs still don't function yet. We're literally born the moment that we're capable of surviving with massive help. So we're all reliant on the people around us to take care of it from birth. That is how it works. And that means that you have an emphasis on communication, because you need to be able to communicate to the people around you what it is that you need from them, and safety and trust and people pleasing. You want the people who are taking care of you to want to continue to take care of you. If they don't, you don't survive.
Yeah.
So it's fundamental. I do think all that's important to say, even though it's not necessarily what we're talking about with people pleasing. Because when we're talking about people pleasing, usually at this point is when people have pathologized whatever it is that they're doing. They're saying that I do things in order to please other people that are bad for me to do for one reason or another. I prioritize pleasing other people over some other thing that I think I should prioritize most highly. Typically, most commonly, things that are good for us, right? That I'll do something to make someone else happy, even though I don't like it and it causes me problems.
Right.
One like little side note, and how we're going to talk about it today is, like we just said, making other people like you is a fundamental part of being human. That's not an invalid reason to do a thing. If you're ever doing something to please somebody else, even though you don't like it, it causes you harm or whatever, it just means that you have identified that it is more beneficial for you, whether that's because of enjoyment or safety or whatever. It's more beneficial for you to make that person happy with you than it is to do whatever other thing you're doing, or avoid doing whatever thing you're doing. And we're wrong about that all the time. And sometimes we're right about it and it sucks, right? Like it's an abuser, and it is actually important to please them or they will harm us, but we shouldn't have to be in a situation. We want to try and find a way out of it.
All right.
But I want to be careful with this term, because like many, many terms, it takes all of the responsibility, all of the onus off of anybody else and makes it about me. I'm a people pleaser, not you are making me feel unsafe, and therefore I feel as though I have to please you. I'm a people pleaser. It's me. And these are patterns of behavior, so it's worth looking at that element. But don't make it all about a person. Don't make it all about your own individual makeup or personality or whatever.
Yeah, because then the onus is on you to fix it.
Right. It prevents you in a real way, not just on an analytical level of saying, oh, what's fair or who should have to change, but in a like moment to moment, as far as executive functioning is concerned, allocation of resources. If I've identified that the problem is me, then it is not very high priority for my brain to allocate any attention or working memory or long-term memory to anything about other people's behavior, because that's irrelevant to the problem. But in a very like pragmatic, functional way, it stops you from getting data that could theoretically help you to solve whatever problem it is you're experiencing, because you only look at the stuff in yourself. Which, by the way, you could call a people-pleasing move, right? Like that, even my people-pleasing isn't your fault, it's me, I'll take care of it.
Right. Is there a gendered aspect to this kind of behavior, or is it
I don't have data
in
on this, but I would assume. I mean, here's what we can say logically, right? Because I don't have data on this. I don't know how, like in the research, I don't know how it would even be defined. I'm sure people have done it, but I've not looked into any of that. Logic, though, if someone is engaging in people-pleasing behavior disproportionate to the necessity of it, the utility of it, right? Like someone's got a gun to my head, I'm going to give them my wallet or whatever that they want. We wouldn't call that people-pleasing. We would say that, yes, that is proportionate. So when we're talking about people-pleasing, it means we're identifying that the extent to which you are doing things to please the other person is beyond what seems reasonable or necessary or helpful, that you're going too far in that direction. If that is the case, if you're doing that in any kind of a pattern, right, in more than just certain contexts that follows you, it's logical to then say that you have been shaped by whatever experiences, processes, genetics, whatever, to be somebody who does that. Genetics, we can't really think about except to say if there's a genetic component, then I guess you're more likely to do it if your parents do it, and less likely if they don't.
Mhm.
But in this particular case, doesn't really hold up, right? Like we find a lot of abusive parents who are clearly not people pleasing to their children, and children who are very big people pleasers. So it seems unlikely there's a lot of genetics there. So then we look at experiences, and what experiences would be more likely to result in somebody who is overly cautious about people pleasing is people who have been exposed to a lot of harm from other people based on the fact that those other people are displeased with them.
Right.
And that seems to me logically, but I don't have the data for this, it seems to me that that's a lot more likely to happen with femme presenting full women, you know, than I should clarify two different categories, I suppose. Well, not really. Yeah, I'm just blah, blah, blah. Right. People who are regarded and treated as feminine
Mhm.
are probably more likely to have experienced harmful or scary or negative consequences in response to someone else being displeased with them. So I would assume that there's more likelihood for people pleasing on that side in terms of gender, but I don't know.
I wonder if it's more common in people who identify as neurodivergent as well because of the fear or rejection sensitivity, fear of social rejection is more pronounced sometimes.
I think that's likely true, but I would argue that at the very least, cause and effect is unclear there,
Mhm.
right? Like, meaning, like we talk about a lot, that the only thing you can definitively say about an individual who identifies as neurodivergent, because there's many different ways to be it and everyone's different, but if they're using that way of referring to themselves, there's one thing you can say definitively, which is that that person has a self-concept and a concept of normal people, and that they have some significant difference between those two concepts, and that that difference they use as an explanation or seek explanation for at least some significant portion of their experiences, most likely at least some negative ones, if maybe positive as well. Well, how would you come to the conclusion that you're different than other people, right? Like to even be like everyone's different, right? Everyone's unique. Some people don't think they are. They think they're normal and that everyone's like them and they behave in that way. Some people don't. Well, people pleasing could be part of that, right? Meaning, or at least come from the same root causes, that you do what you think someone else would want and be happy about because it's what you would be happy about. And
Mhm.
then their response to you indicates, nope, they don't like that. So there's a very real experience of, okay, either I misevaluated something here or they don't like the things I like. They want something different. Because in order to engage in people pleasing behavior, whatever you mean by that, you have to be able to identify that what the other person wants or would benefit from or would like or enjoys, whatever, is different than what I would. So you have to have a concept of being different. So I
Right.
think there's probably a big correlation there, but I don't know that it's necessary. Neurodivergent people are more likely to be people pleasers in that kind of sequential
Yeah,
order.
I gotcha. So people pleasing in and of itself isn't problematic until it is, and that's something that's individual, right? It's a behavior you start to notice in yourself that you find you're no longer comfortable with, or you start to feel like you're being taken advantage of, or you're stressed or you're tired because you're doing so much for others. And so I guess in itself, people pleasing is not a problem
Well,
until it
by
is.
the official like technical way we're talking about it of
Yeah.
just doing something to make someone else happy. No, not a problem. And I point that out partly because I have so many clients who will come and say, like, I need to figure out what I want for myself, not for other people. And those are not things that you can separate from one another. That's not how we work as humans. So sometimes people get this idea that I should be able to think about something that I want for me and only me and not think about how it would impact anybody else or what anybody else would think about it. And it's not that that never happens, but it's pretty rare. And even if it does, everything about who you are has still been shaped by experiences with other people and in response to other. It's baked into us. We
Yeah.
are, there's no such thing as an individual human isolated. No man is an island, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
so I say that because sometimes people will say, well, I'm doing this because they want me to and I wouldn't. And while that can be true, if there's reason behind that shouldn't, it's also fine to do something because somebody else wants you to. Sometimes that other person is your boss and you need them to not fire you. And therefore, yes, it makes sense to do what they want, even though you don't want it. Sometimes that person is your partner and we call it compromise or sacrifice. Or sometimes that person is your teacher and they know some stuff you don't know. So you do it because you trust that by doing the things that they're suggesting you do, even though you're only doing it because they're telling you to, they discover or learn. It's not an inherently bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this falls into a category of things that what we really are talking about is proportionality, like more than seems useful or less than seems useful. Sensitivity is this way too, right? If you have an auditory sensitivity, well, everybody hears, well, everyone who does hear anyway, everyone who hears things hears some things. And we're saying if you have a hypersensitivity to sound, that you're hearing it at a level that seems more than is necessary, more than is useful. If it's a hyposensitivity, then we're saying, okay, it seems as though you're hearing things at a rate lower than is useful. But we take these things that really just mean too much or too little and have to be assessed contextually, situationally, right, in regards to whether or not or to what it's useful, and we change it into something binary. There's an appropriate amount and an inappropriate amount. Not too much or too little, just unhealthy, inappropriate, bad. And it all gets kind of mushed together. But yeah, if we're going to talk about people pleasing, then what we really want to focus, if we're going to talk about it in that way that most people do, as though it's a problem, because it is, it can label problems, then we have to say, well, what's the problem? What specific problem is it causing? It's not just that it's bad that you care about making other people happy, unless there's something happening that you don't like, that you don't enjoy, or is causing problems in some way that you're connecting to. That's only happening because I care too much about making other people happy. So we always want to go back to what is the actual thing that's happening that you've identified. If I change my people pleasing tendencies, that thing will change. Otherwise, how are you going to know if it's too much or too little or whatever?
Mm-hmm. So say you identify a pattern, you identify something that
That I
repeats.
do it more than is useful or
Yeah.
necessary, or that I default to it when there would have been other better options had I considered it more, things like that. That's
Yeah.
usually when we're talking about it, right?
Mm-hmm. It's not that other people are taking advantage. It's that maybe you're not communicating that you don't have capacity, or you
Well,
don't want to communicate that you don't have capacity because you don't want to let somebody down.
or it might be, well, like the pattern of behavior for me that neither of those things are applicable, but does cause me problem is I run late in sessions and in meetings in this stream because the person in front of me, I'm so focused on them and responding to them and saying the things that seem to me to potentially be helpful or interesting that I forget about other people that I would also want to please. So it's not a matter of capacity and I need boundaries for self-care or whatever. It's a matter of the person in front of me takes more focus than the person that I'm supposed to talk to next.
Yeah.
And yes, it can happen. I do think that taking advantage phrase is a tricky one here
Mm-hmm.
because to me that can mean two different things. One is a person knows the ways in which you're going to respond to what they're doing and has identified them as useful to them even though it's harmful to you or inappropriate or whatever, and knowingly engages in still doing the things that make you respond in that way because it's beneficial to them. That's like an active, they're taking advantage, they are
Yeah.
making it so that you are likely to respond the way that they're going for. But another way of talking about it is just that the person, who they are and how they behave, just so happens to mesh with me and how I interpret things and how I feel and behave in such a way that I do keep falling into this pattern of overdoing stuff with them. But it's not because they're actively intending to do it.
Right.
They're not doing anything wrong. It's just,
Yeah.
this to me is important because it relates to something we'll probably talk about some other time, which is actually maybe today it's related, the fear of being a burden.
Mm-hmm.
People who are people pleasers also tend to, because the flip side of that is if I'm not making people happy, I'm not valuable. If I'm making people have to do they wouldn't otherwise want to do, I'm a burden, right? So sometimes those people who are quote unquote taking advantage, if it's in that second way, wouldn't if they knew what was going on. They don't want to be a burden. And it is about communicating it to them. Or maybe you don't know it yourself, or it's just the phrase carries this sense of active, they are doing a bad thing. But that pattern isn't always that. And you can get stuck because you can say, well, if someone's taking advantage of me, I should set a boundary or change it. But is this person taking advantage of me? They're so nice, they're not doing anything wrong. I guess I'll just keep doing it. You can identify that the pattern isn't working out well, even though the person isn't mean or doing anything bad.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And, you know, maybe people come to you and ask you to do stuff because they've recognized, they've identified that you're somebody who can do the thing that they need done. And that's a positive thing.
Yeah. Or maybe
Yeah.
they've identified that you enjoy being helpful. Like,
Yeah.
I enjoy being helpful. People come to me for help, part at least because it's very clear that I want to help. I like it. It makes me feel good. So they don't feel as much of a burden. I put work and effort into making it, especially in my role as a therapist or as a supervisor or whatever. I'm very conscientious about doing what I can to make people feel safe in coming to me with things.
Right.
That no matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter what you're struggling with, whether you feel like it's something that you shouldn't be or you feel like it's a burden to me or whatever, I would still rather know about it. And of course, then that gets into the tree stuff where I have to, in order to do that, I have to make sure that I have what I would consider boundaries in place, and I don't think my definition is a little bit different than the more common one. Not just for myself, but for the other person. If you come to me and tell me about a problem and I feel an obligation to help you, even though it's an inappropriate level of effort on my part or blurring some roles or causing me some problem, well, if you are somebody who is worried about being a burden, which most of the people I work with are, like, I think kind of generally most people are, they just don't think they're a burden, right? Like nobody wants to be. If you're worried about being a burden, it's possible that you will read that in me, that this is actually really difficult for me and now I'm stressed and feel obligated, which makes it harder for you to come in the future. A specific example of this is I tell all my clients and staff, everybody, you can reach out to me whenever you want. Call me, text me, email me, 3 a.m, whatever. You do not have to worry about it because I am religious about turning off my notifications when it would be a bother to me. You will not ever bother me because it's my responsibility to make sure that you don't bother me. Because I don't want clients to be sitting there at 2 a.m. thinking, man, I really want to text Brandon about this thing, but it's 2 a.m, I shouldn't bother him.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want them to do that extra work. And the only way I can eliminate that is by telling them up front, you will not bother me. The flip side of that is that you have to know I'm going to see it when it's an appropriate time, an okay time for me to see it. I'm going to respond to it when it's an okay time for me to respond to it. So don't expect that I'm going to get back to you at 2 a.m, but also don't worry about whether it'll be a bother.
Yeah.
I kind of got off on some things there. Went down the
Yeah, no, but boundaries is something I think we need to talk about. So, in terms of like how to deal with people pleasing, if you're seeing it as something that's having a negative impact on your own life, one of the questions here is how do I overcome my fear of disappointing other people? And then how do I set stronger boundaries and enforce them? I think setting a boundary is one thing, but being able to maintain that boundary can be challenging sometimes.
For the first, you won't. Why would you? Like, it's a scary thing to disappoint somebody else. Unless it's not, right? Like that person, no matter who you are, you're not worried about disappointing every individual in the world because you just don't have literally the capacity to think about that.
Yeah.
You can worry about disappointing anyone you're thinking of, even if it's someone you're only noticing and thinking of for a moment on the street. That happens all the time. But you can't worry about everybody. So part of it is making that shift that you're not worried about disappointing everybody. You're worried about disappointing the specific people that you are thinking of when you're worried about disappointing them. So the first thing I would say for that is to go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. Get rid of this idea that you have a fear of disappointing people that is contained within you as an individual. There are times you are worried about it and times you are not, right? And even if theoretically a person was always worried about it, which isn't possible, like you don't worry about it when you're asleep, for example, you don't worry about it when your mind is taken by other tasks and you don't have the capacity to worry about it. And I know that I'm kind of deliberately, probably what someone means when they're saying I have a fear of disappointing people. They've noticed a pattern of behavior, thought about it ex post facto, after the fact, and said, why would I do that stuff? Probably because I'm afraid of disappointing people. But I'm deliberately responding to it this way to make it about the active experience of fearing disappointing someone. Because if it's not that, then we could tell any story about anything, and what are you supposed to do about it? It's just a story we're telling. We could take the same behaviors, the same experiences, and tell a different story that involves being afraid of disappointing people. So it's just not very useful. It's not that it's not accurate. I'm sure it is. This person would know. But it's not very useful. There's not much you can do about that. If you think about it as actively worrying, then even if you theoretically always worried about disappointing, or always were afraid, fear, always were afraid of disappointing other people, it's not the same all the time. Sometimes you're more afraid, sometimes you're less afraid. Either way, because that's what we're getting to, is that starts to give you some information. You start to observe patterns external to you, right? Like, when are those times? What are those relationships? What are the requests being asked of me, or that I'm interpreting, or think someone's implying, even if they're not directly? What are things that increase that fear of disappointing someone? And
Yeah,
then I
because
can
it
start to
depends on the person you're dealing with, right? Like
right,
I would be really upset to know that I had disappointed my mom about something. But a coworker, if I didn't get a piece of work done or something, I would have less that the bar shifts. I think I'd be like, well, I'm sorry I didn't get it done.
yeah,
I'll pick it up tomorrow. It depends on the
right.
emotional connection with the other person, I think.
And in that particular case, I'm just guessing here, and you certainly don't need to say, but I'm guessing that it doesn't bother you how much you care about disappointing your mom or pleasing your mom or whatever, that you're fine with that level of it. So that's back to, it's not like there's some externally identified, that's, you care too much about that person's opinion now, right?
Yeah, it's not that. It's I love my mom and I don't
Right.
want to.
Which we should talk
That's
sometime
the
about
universal
love.
word.
Because that's kind of what it means to care about somebody, is my perception of your state impacts my state. If I think you're sad, it makes me sad. If I think
Yeah.
you're happy, it makes me happy to some extent, not exactly the same. But what else would love mean in some like categorizable way that's not just about an experience that I feel momentarily or whatever? Anyway,
Mhm.
um, you start to identify those things, because then that gives you some stuff to start to work with. If I realize, oh, you know what? I really get most afraid of disappointing people when it's like late at night and I'm tired. Then you can make some changes about the pattern of your life, or be more careful about who you're talking to at, like, again, a practical and very common piece of advice that can come from this is turn off your email notifications from work after 5 p.m. If you are whenever you get a message from someone at work, if you are, oh God, I can't disappoint them, that fear comes up, you engage in people pleasing, doing things that you don't think you should do or cause problems. Well, eliminate the trigger then. Just make it so that you can't see what they're saying. But that kind of manipulating the environment, including communicating with other people about your experience and how they impact you and blah, 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 that's only something that you can really do once you've identified the ways in which the environment impacts you and other people impact you. So you start there.
Mhm.
And then with boundaries, I said I think about it slightly differently than people usually talk about it, because I like to separate it, and maybe other people talk about it this way. I don't know. If so, somebody tell me if you know, because I would like to know. I like to break it down into reactive boundaries and proactive boundaries. Things that you do in response to something and things that you do in advance of something. Most people, when they're talking about boundaries, are talking about what I would call reactive boundaries, meaning I have identified a limit at which, if someone is making a request of me, it is inappropriate, it's too much, I can handle it, they shouldn't be feeling entitled to it, whatever. And when they do, I need to say no, which I would only set that boundary if I usually say yes in those circumstances. And here's the problem with reactive boundaries. Not that they're bad, set them by all means. Just don't think that they're the only kinds of boundaries. The problem is that saying no is difficult.
Yeah.
Humans want to please each other. And if you're someone who's identifying yourself as a people pleaser, it's even more difficult for you. That's part of what you're saying. Not to mention the fact that anytime you're doing something, anytime anyone is doing something differently, trying a new thing, responding differently, it takes more effort than doing it the way you usually do it. So you're setting for yourself a very difficult task. And what is the context in which you are supposed to engage in that? Usually with reactive boundaries is when you're close to your limit. You're saying, I am so tired, I am so booked, I have done so much that I can't do any. So you're very likely to be very drained or distracted or stressed or whatever, and not really have the resources that you need in that moment to remember that you're supposed to say no, much less actually do it. If it was easy for you to do, you wouldn't have to be consciously setting these boundaries. So they have a very, very high failure rate, very likely to not work. And why is that a problem? Because whose fault is it now? They asked you for something inappropriate and you said yes, but you should have enforced your boundaries. It's not on them, it's on you. Damn it. So I don't try to talk to the other people about what they're doing. I don't go back to them later and say, hey, I know I agreed to this thing, but actually blah, blah, blah. I say, dang it, I failed to set a boundary. Now I have to do the thing. It's a very low chance of success. And we identify it as being the sole source, like the sole solution to the problem. So when it fails, we don't try anything else.
Yeah.
So set them, by all means. But try to set them much earlier than your limits so that you're more likely to have the energy that you need. When you do set them, you can then go into what I would call proactive boundaries too. You can take the same thing and communicate it in advance. Hey, just so you know, I will no longer be available to respond to emails after 5 o'clock. It's a boundary I need to set. Are people still going to email you after 5 o'clock? Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But now when you're trying to get yourself to say, I don't have to respond, it should be a little easier because you did already tell them that you can't. Right?
But a lot of it means being able to tap into an awareness of your own energy levels, what you've got coming up, a little bit of future planning, things that we might struggle with as neurodivergent identifying people, right?
Yeah. And that neurodivergent or not, the more tired and drained you are, the more your resources are being spent, the harder it is to do. But yes, definitely a correlation for people who struggle with executive functioning and neurodivergent people and people pleasing.
Yeah.
Honestly, some other time we'll talk more about this stuff, but I really do think that on the whole, neurodivergent people are much more sensitive to social data and are much more effective communicators, even though it seems like the opposite.
Right.
Sometimes at least, because people will say like, I'm a bad communicator. But what does that mean? If you think of yourself as a bad communicator, it means something happened where you tried to communicate something and people responded in a way that you didn't anticipate, and you noticed it and you attributed the fact that that response happened in that way to the communication, which means you're thinking about communication and how different people respond and interpret different things. And the things that people feel the worst at are usually the things that they're the best at comparatively, because they're spending their resources if they think the thing is important. Right? Anyway, so that yes, I think there is a reason that neurodivergent people are more likely to be people pleasers. We, for whatever reason, however we got here, and I think it's different for different people, we pay more attention to how other people respond and how those responses are a result of what we are doing that impacts them. We don't say they misunderstood me. We say, I didn't communicate it well.
Right.
Anyway, I got us off track again. What were you saying before that? We were talking about, proactive boundaries.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the bigger one. And it's hard, not necessarily easier. It's harder to set up than a reactive boundary, because reactive boundary is easy. You identify a thing that happens that causes problems. And if I responded differently, it wouldn't cause problems, right? You don't have to think very much about it. Proactive boundary is, how do I structure my life in a way that two different things, that either the triggers that cause me to violate my boundaries, I'm not exposed to them, or I'm not exposed to them as much. So telling people, hey, don't email me after 5, I'm not available, means that you'll probably have an easier time of it. Sometimes those people will have heard you and will not email you after 5. Sometimes they've just raised the bar a little bit of how important it needs to seem to them to message you. Sometimes they haven't changed anything at all, but on your end, it's easier for you to not respond because you did tell them, right? But it's still going to happen.
Yeah.
Whereas if I turn off my notifications for the email, or put an out of office autoresponder that I turn on every day at 5 o'clock and turn off every morning at 9 a.m. or whatever your schedule is, that says, I am currently out of the office, I will return at 9 a.m. Then you don't have to do that work of when it comes through being like, no, I don't need to do this. It just doesn't come through. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is structuring your life such that all of your resources are taken up by the things you want them to be taken up with. Right? Like if a friend asks you to move, which is a common example of boundaries and whatever, and you say no, if you are free that weekend and you could help them move without it causing you to miss out on something else or whatever, you don't have a good reason to give them. It's a lot harder to just say no, it's a boundary. No, I don't have it in me, whatever. But if your time booked with something you wanted, oh no, I'm sorry, I can't. That's when I have my tennis lessons. It's a lot easier. And the more you do that, the less people are going to ask you.
Yeah.
We, again, neurodivergent people especially know this. People ask you to go out, come on out with us, come on out. You say no. They ask you again, come on out. You say no. Come on out. No. Now they're not asking anymore. Because why would they? They think they're bothering you. They think you don't want to come out. You teach people when you're available, when you're not.
Mm-hmm.
I worked at a place once where this was asking people for rides to the airport and things that I think are kind of, not totally professional. I don't want to be too harsh because I like the guy, but and the others would ask me like, how do you say no? And he never asked me, never once. And part of it is I was married and had a kid and they were younger, but it just shows that people will perceive it, some better than others, some won't care more than others, whatever. But if I appear to everyone as somebody who has booked my time, booked my energy, then they're not going to ask as much. But even if they do, it doesn't matter. If I'm so engrossed in something that I can't pay attention to anything else and you ask me for something, I don't have to actively say no. I don't even hear it. I'm doing this. So it's inclusive versus exclusive, which is real big in parenting stuff too. We want to identify what are the things, if you need to set a boundary, it's quite likely that you're saying it's because there are things that you should be doing, could be doing, want to be doing, would be good for you to do that you're not. And you have identified that the reason that you're not is because you're drained too much. Your resources are going to these other things that they shouldn't be going to, and you're trying to cut off to be able to do these things. Instead, get these things in first. That's the important part. That's why you're doing it, is to do this stuff. Do that stuff. Consider that sacred, must be done. And then anything that's done on top of that, people can make whatever requests they want. Anything you're okay with because you already did all the stuff you need to do or care about doing.
So is there a tendency then to deprioritize ourselves that can result in this people pleasing?
Sure.
Yeah.
And to kind of misidentify the problem, right? That the problem is I'm not good enough at saying no, which is an accurate way of describing it and a useful way of describing it to some extent. But especially for people who have identified that you set boundaries and I try and it doesn't work. I need to set boundaries and I try and it doesn't work. And then I'm just beating myself up. Why am I so bad at boundaries? What's wrong with me? And blah, blah, blah. Try a different thing. And here's a different thing you can try instead of just going back to that same well over and over. Yeah, we could talk about it as you're prioritizing your stuff less. We could also identify it as a misevaluation of how things work. Nature abhors a vacuum is one of my favorite phrases. You don't free up resources. You just decrease the amount of resources going to something. but those resources are still going. You don't save that extra time. You don't get a like account to deposit the extra time that you save. It just goes to something else. And if you haven't identified what is the other thing that you want it to be going towards, and therefore haven't identified the things that you can actively do to try and get more likely, at least, that you do those things instead, then how are you going to cut out of what you're already doing? Trying to open up time to be empty doesn't work. And what's the easiest thing, the most likely thing that that time is going to fill back up with is the stuff that was already there before. It's harder to identify new and different stuff. If you are waiting around for things to open up, they never open up. We know this, right? Like people say all the time, oh, once I get through this urgent time, or once the holidays are past, once this, once that, once my boss, once I've settled in more and I feel more confident in my role, and it's just another thing and another thing. You have to identify what it is you're trying to do in order to make it important to stop doing some stuff. Otherwise, why? You will feel selfish. No, I shouldn't do that thing, even though I could, and it wouldn't cause me any problem because there's nothing else I need to be doing. I have the energy, I have the time, I have the free. Then yeah, you're going to feel bad. That's how it works. Doesn't mean you should do that thing. It just means you're going to feel bad.
Yeah. So I have an issue where I feel like I over explain myself if I don't have time or capacity to do something. And then I feel like I'm making excuses, which I am. I'm giving an explanation, but it starts to feel like making excuses. But I feel like I have to give somebody all of the information, all of the context as to why I can't do something. And something I read recently is no is a complete sentence. And I really like that.
I do too. And let's acknowledge, because sometimes that just makes people feel bad for saying more
Yeah.
than no, right? Let's acknowledge that, sure, it is a complete sentence. And sometimes we say second sentences, right? Like, because the context is different. Sometimes it is fine that I want to say, hey, let me explain to you
Mm-hmm.
why I'm not going to do this thing or can't do this thing. Your over explanations, I think there are some obviously problems there because you've identified it as a problem, and we can talk about some things that can be done. But same with all this stuff, anything that's going to work has to identify what the problem is first. If we've misidentified the problem as I'm too much of a people pleaser and has nothing to do with anybody else or anything else, then what strategy am I going to come up with that's going to actually do anything? I'm ignoring all that data. It's unlikely. It can happen, but it's very unlikely. Same here. If you just think you over explain, no, it is worth giving people more reasoning than just no sometimes. So maybe the problem is that you're struggling to identify when it's worth doing more and when it's not. And you're just responding to everything as though it's a time where you need to give explanation, which wouldn't right there, just that way of saying it, open up different things to do to practice identifying when it's necessary, when it's not, instead of just shifting yourself to, well, I always do it and now I should never do it. No, I just say no. Again, that's going to feel bad because it feels bad for a reason.
Yeah.
It can cause problems. People can read it as curt or rude or dismissive and then like you less and hate you more and cause harm to you. And it can cause problems. There's nothing wrong with that. So work on identifying what it's worth doing. And then if you're doing that and you still find afterwards, because my bet is if you, as you go on that and improve that, that automatically your responses will shift. You won't have to do anything actively, right? Like if it's in my case, if it's my wife, I don't need to write more than no. I'm safe, right? Like I'm not worried she's going to bite my head off for saying no. And if she does have a problem, I trust that she'll come back to me and tell me that she needs more explanation and I can give it to her as necessary. I don't have to guess how much she would want. If it's my boss, depending on the relationship with my boss, then I might want to just say, okay, it would cause me a problem, or at least could, if they think that I'm saying no for no reason. And I don't trust that they would tell me if they don't like what I'm doing, right? Like, because if I do that, if I just say no and I trust them to say, can you explain to me why? Then I can. If I'm explaining in advance, it's because I don't trust them to come to me and tell me that they want to know why. It means I'm
Yeah.
worried that they'll think that I'm a jerk and not give me the opportunity to explain.
Mm-hmm.
automatically, I think, as you start to identify how safe am I with the person, how much do I trust them to let me know if they want some reasoning, and so on and so forth. And I think how much you do will automatically shift. But if it doesn't, then at least that point you again still have more data. When there are times where I find myself over explaining more than other times, how do I deal with that? Including something I've done in the past, which is learning to get comfortable with just saying, because what actually causes me problems in written communication more than anything else is when I try to be brief, as is probably self-evident to anybody here. I like nuance. It's important to me to acknowledge there are different things going on, and I have a hard time with just shortening to something that I know could be interpreted to mean what I mean, but I also could be interpreted to mean something else that makes me nervous.
Yeah.
So it's actually much faster for me to write longer messages than shorter ones. And when it's stuck, it's usually because I'm trying to shorten everything down, and it's really hard because I can't stop thinking about how it could be interpreted, which I could clarify with another sentence too long. And so one thing I learned to start doing at a certain point was to just say in the communication. In fact, there's a particular term I learned from a client once called bluff, bottom line up front. It's a military term, apparently, that I write the full on message I want to write. Don't stop myself, edit myself, make myself go, short or whatever. Right where I want to write, give all the reasoning I want to give instead of trying to fight myself. No, I don't need to give that, and that takes more energy for me. Then when I'm done with it, then I say, okay, what's the if they only had the time and attention to read one or two lines, what is that? And then I go to the top of the message and label it bluff, BLUF. Of course, you want to communicate with people about what BLUF means. Before I learned this term from my client, I referred to it as the TLDR up front.
Yes. Yeah.
Instead of at the bottom. I identify it, write that. And then either it's somebody I've communicated with in advance and told, hey, if you only want this, that's the point, you only need that, great. If you need more, all my other thoughts are down below and you can look at it. And if not, I have at times even put in the message, here's the point, and then write it. And here is all my thoughts that lead to it, or things I think might be interesting to you. You're welcome to read it, but you also don't have to. Sometimes I even will put in my message on multiple occasions, because of the nature of my work. I communicate with people about neurodiversity and etc. On multiple occasions, I have written lines like, if nothing else, I hope this message itself serves as a good example of neurodivergent communication. That I know I'm talking unusually and etc.
Yeah. I do the same
Identify.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know a lot of ADHD people I know really appreciate if you put the bottom line up front. I'd never heard that phrase before, but yeah, the TLDR one is one that comes up a lot. I do another thing where I put bullet points in and give a one line summary in bold and then elaborate in a paragraph below the one line summary.
See, that's great in terms of, does it help other people to process the information? Because for some people, at least, if not most or all people, yes, it's easier if things are separate. That's why we use paragraph punctuation and whatever. But in terms of people pleasing, that's the thing that probably takes more effort on your part to make the information more accessible for them. So a good thing, though, if you're trying to communicate with people who struggle to, read long messages and whatever, not an answer to people pleasing, though.
No.
And that's why I like the way I do it. Is just, for me, it's easier that way. For other people, it's easier to just say a brief thing and they force themselves to add the extra. And it's about learning not to, or adding brief statements like, I can explain in more detail if you have questions or whatever, stuff like that. I'm happy to talk about this further if you'd like, blah, blah, blah. Let me know if you have questions, whatever.
Yeah, you're putting the ball back in the other person's court, so then they get the decision. Yeah.
Written communication in particular is a real problem here, because, especially for neurodivergent people, because again, what do we know about neurodivergent people? That they are aware that different people will respond to the same thing in different ways. Different people will see the same thing and consider it to be something different than one another, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that communication is nerve-wracking, because even if we feel as though we're saying what we mean to say, we also know someone might interpret it differently. like they're of causing harm to people, for example, is really linked to this, right? Like if I say something that I don't mean to be harmful or offensive, but other people interpret it in a way that harms them, now I'm stuck in this position of like, well, I want to acknowledge them that I caused, but also I didn't mean it that way, but that's a bull crap apology and I should just own up to. And I think there's nothing wrong. Obviously, social media is a difficult place to do this and other people would disagree, but I don't think there's anything wrong with saying like, okay, I did not realize that was the impact that it would have, and I am sorry that I hurt you, or I'm sorry I impacted you in that way. Just so that you know, here's what my intent was. I'm not saying that you responded incorrectly or that I have no culpability here or whatever. I I caused harm. I recognize that, and I appreciate you giving me the feedback because it is not what I wanted to do, and now I can adjust moving forward to make it less likely that I will do this again. And I don't want you to lose my message. I don't want you to think of me as somebody who meant to harm you that way. Harm is harm,
Yeah.
but if it's unintentional or intentional, there's a difference, not in the harm that was caused, but in what happens moving forward, how you think of me, how we interact with one another, so on and so forth. I'm dancing in a room and you walk in and I don't realize and I punch you and I break your nose. I broke your nose. Doesn't matter that it was an accident or whatever. The nose is broken. But there's a big difference between somebody who punches you in the nose on purpose to break it when you walk into a room and somebody who was dancing and didn't notice you come in and accidentally broke your nose. Nose is broken, but what you from there, how you think of them, what, changes.
Mm.
Otherwise, you're going to act like everybody who causes you harm did it intentionally. And that's going to make this people pleasing thing way worse.
Yeah.
Because
So,
people will unintentionally harm you. If you think it's intentional, you'll be terrified of everyone all the time. And you're going to then respond to that by either not being exposed to people as much as possible, isolating, insulating yourself from the potential for them to harm you, or trying to guess, because again, this is a neurodivergent thing, right? Trying to guess, yeah, times in the past I've been wrong. I thought that I said wouldn't cause the other person to want to harm me or think less of me, but it did. So I better safe than sorry. I'm going to overdo it this time rather than underdo it. And then I'll overdo it more and overdo it. And every time it happens, I just add more and more and more. Back to your excuses thing, am I giving an explanation or excuse? I challenge anybody to define excuse versus reason versus explanation in any way, like categorically differentiate those things in any way that does not rely on the point of view of the speaker. If I think your reason isn't a good and valid one, it's not a good enough reason, then I'll call it an excuse. If I think it's a good enough one, I'll say it's a reason or an explanation. But is there something you could point to that makes it wrong definitively for me to call it an excuse when I think it's not valid and a reason when it is? It's just, if someone can, that's why I issue the challenge. If someone can I love categorical definitions. Please tell me how you have defined it to identify without relying on the speaker point of view.
yeah.
Running on and on. What you were going to say something?
Oh, so one other question here. So say you've become more comfortable setting boundaries, and most people are adjusting to these boundaries and respecting them. What happens when you come up against a situation where you set the boundary, but somebody keeps ignoring it or overstepping the line?
Meaning that they continue to make requests of you?
Yeah, continue to disregard whatever
so that
boundary set.
you're continuing to have to reactively say stop or no.
Yeah. I think there's a tendency to say, well, I must be doing, like you said, I've communicated this wrong. I must be getting it wrong. But what if that's not the case? What if it's just...
Well, part of the reason that this whole thing happens is because you can never definitively say it's not the case. No matter what words I use and what nonverbal language I use to communicate a boundary to someone, if I'm speaking English and they don't, it's not going to come across, right? That's the whole, when we talk at other times about the faultless miscommunication. It's not that I'm misspeaking. It's not that you're mishearing. It's just the thing I'm attempting to do to get my point across is being interpreted to you by something other than what I'm tempting and that they're both valid. And it's a really hard question to answer because it depends on the person and the circumstance, right? Like, I would say one kind of more general response to that would be you need to structure your life in such a way that this person has fewer opportunities to violate your boundaries. This is where I would go back to focusing on the proactive more than the reactive. In any case where one strategy isn't working, in this case, the reactive strategy isn't working, it's not always about how do I do that strategy better. It's what's another strategy I can try, right? If someone keeps, I don't know, what's a common boundary that someone might keep trying to violate, even though you've tried to communicate to them about it?
Yeah, calling you on your personal number when you said unless the place is on fire, please don't call me about work stuff on my personal number.
Yeah, so you could identify it as how do I communicate this better? In that particular instance, you would want to look at how are you identifying work stuff versus how are they identifying work stuff? Maybe they just think the stuff they're calling about isn't work stuff, and you need to clarify between the two of you what then. What exactly do I mean unless the place is on fire? You might literally mean unless the place is on fire, and they just think you mean unless it's important or whatever. So there's some communication stuff that could be done there. But also, you block them from your personal number, and they can only call your work number, and you set your boundaries, your literal boundaries on the work number, like the do not disturb hours so that calls don't come through at other times. And then they're going to complain likely if they keep violating this, if they're going to complain, why aren't you answering? Why aren't you getting my calls? And you say, because I explained to you already that this is how it works. I just didn't explain it in a way that made sense to you, or you forgot, or whatever. It doesn't matter. But just so you know, I don't take any work calls after 5. It's not that I'm blocking you specifically. I'm just blocking all work calls. So you can call me on my work number or whatever it is.
I guess the important thing here is don't feel bad about setting these boundaries if they're going to.
Well, yes, but also if we say that, right? If we say don't feel bad about it, again, we're ignoring that sometimes there's reason to feel bad about it.
Oh yeah.
So
sure.
We always want to be careful about these kind of moral edicts, because then people will feel bad. Sometimes some people will interpret it to mean that if I do anything differently than that in any circumstance, I have failed. It's not about don't feel bad. It's about identify what is the specific reason that you feel bad. Is it because you think this person is lonely and they're just reaching out to you and they need work as an excuse in the particular example? In which case, do you want to do something about their loneliness? And if so, can you do something that would be more within your boundaries instead of this over and over? Are you feeling bad because they just don't quite seem to get like the social norms, or they kind of communicate in an odd way and seem to miss cues from not only you, but other people? In which case, is there something you can do to communicate with them differently, or be more explicit, or learn from them about what makes sense and blah, blah, blah. You don't have to do any of those things, but you also don't have to not feel bad. And you also don't just have to sit with your feeling bad and say, well, I'm supposed to not, I only feel bad about this because there's nothing to be done. That's why I'm supposed to not feel bad. And I'm just feeling bad when I shouldn't. That's why I have to sit with it. Like, there's probably things that can be done.
Yeah.
And you can always enlist other people too, like some more generic things. If someone continuously violates a boundary, other people that have influence with that person, maybe because it's helpful that they speak a language with that person that will enable them to communicate it in a way that you don't. Also, it's just useful for people to get the same message from 2 different perspectives sometimes, or someone that can kind of monitor and, if it's their roommate that you're talking to and listening their help with all this, then when they notice them going for it, which will be sometimes because they're home, they say, hey, remember, don't blah, 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 or whatever. Also, if there's a reason that you're feeling bad, if there's some reason that they need to be doing the thing that they have identified and communicated to you, or you just look at alternative ways to engage that, right? Like if they have a need that you think legitimate or valid, or even if you don't, but you feel bad about not helping with, what other things can be done to meet that need so that it's not just a binary option of either I sacrifice my boundary and help them, or I maintain my boundary and don't help them, because that will feel bad. Just one thing I find useful to talk about responsibility generally is it's not something to me, the most useful way to talk about it. It's not something other people put on you. If you identify something that is different than you want it to be, and you also think that there is something you can do which will make it more like what you think it should be, then you'll feel good if you do the thing and you'll feel bad if you don't. Period. Doesn't matter if anyone else identifies that you have an obligation. You see somebody on the street needing help and you don't, and you feel bad. Nobody's saying you should, or at
Yeah.
least they don't need to. You're going to feel bad.
Yeah.
But don't like turn it into this pathological thing that you feel bad. Humans are wired to want to help each other. It's our survival strategy. We are evolved to be that way. If you see someone else in pain, there are two responses to that that are pretty much automatic, and there's nothing you can do about them. One is, how did that happen to them, and how do I make sure it's not going to happen to me? The other is, how can I help them not be in pain?
Yeah.
That's going to happen if you notice it, if you notice someone's pain. That's why some people's response is to just stop seeing other people's pain. Or a very convenient explanation that answers both those questions is to say, well, they chose it. Because if they chose it, I don't need to worry about it happening to me because I wouldn't choose it. And if they chose it, I don't need to help them because they chose it. It's what they want. But why is someone on the street? Well, because they're making bad choices. Why is someone, literally anything that is unpleasant, painful for people to experience, you can just say, well, they made bad choices, which is a misstatement, means nothing, except I don't have to worry about it happening to me and I don't have to help them.
Mm.
Also why it's very common for pop culture psychology stuff to be some version of, actually, by not helping people, that's how you really help them.
Yeah.
Don't enable them. Don't be codependent. Don't be a helicopter parent. The way to really help people is to not help them, because it's just a way to trick ourselves into not feeling bad about the fact that we're not helping them. Which comes back to boundaries.
Mm.
Sometimes it's easier to give yourself a reason, even if it is a kind of a silly reason, like, oh, yes, tough love. How will they ever learn, right? It's just a way of saying, I don't want to help them. I don't think it's appropriate that I should have to help them, or I don't think I'm capable of helping them, but I still feel bad. How do I make myself stop feeling bad even though I'm not helping them? Well, it's how will they learn? And it's fine. It's totally acceptable to think that. Just know what it is. And yes, if you're trying to communicate to other people about your pain and they're not seeing it or not treating it as valid, it's still the same response. If they treat it as valid, if they understand it, if you have long COVID and you tell them about it, they're going to want to say, well, how do I make sure it doesn't happen to me? And how do I help them? Well, it's not going to happen to me because it's fake. It's made up. It's psychological, psychosomatic. So it won't happen to me because they're making it up. And I don't need to help them because it's made up. There's nothing I could do. It's in their head. All I can do to help them is to tell them it's in their head. And then they do that. And they could feel like they're helping you. Anyway, we're getting off and we're running late. Did we get through like a significant chunk of the questions? I don't even know.
We did. Yeah, I think we got through all of them. Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, well, there was one actually, and it might actually be a whole topic in itself, about people pleasing, but how it interacts with the stress response cycle, and stress-induced chronic illness. So chronic illness is probably something we should talk about at some point. Stress.
That
and
would be
chronic
good. And I
Yeah.
totally didn't think about the fact that people pleasing is often talked about in terms of a trauma response.
Mm,
You know, people will say fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn meaning give people what they want.
yeah.
And sure, yes, but also like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, none of those are inherently bad things. Those are wired into us because they are often like across the board generically, if we don't have the opportunity or the ability to kind of individually assess a context and come up with a specific response, if it's just default, then those things, pretty much anything you do is going to fall into one of those four categories.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a way of identifying it. And yes, it's useful to talk about it as a trauma response, like we mentioned at the beginning, if you have been in traumatic situations in which people being displeased with you causes them to harm you. Action, that's the wrong way to say it. If people harm you and they give you the impression, or for whatever reason you come to the conclusion that that harm is related to their being displeased with you, because you don't cause it. I wanted to be clear. I said that wrong. If you are harmed and you have identified for some reason, maybe they told you this or maybe it's something else, that the cause of that, you've identified that the cause of that harm is them being displeased with you, then of course you're going to be more likely to want to be safe, better safe than sorry, overcorrect in the future. So yeah, it's a trauma response, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And just like fight, flight, freeze, which are all framed in ways as though they're bad, and fawn is framed as though it's bad, they're not bad. Like, not inherently, they're just unconsidered. When in that state, that prefrontal cortex shutdown state, you're reacting by instinct, not thinking about what you're doing. It's just a default response to stimuli. But the reason it's the default response to stimuli is because that's what happens. You know, sometimes you got to push back on a thing. Sometimes you got to get away from a thing. Sometimes you got to just hold still and wait until the thing passes. And sometimes you got to ask for help or get somebody else to take care of the thing for you.
Yeah.
Not inherently bad. So it still goes back to identify the difference. Because another trauma response, if we're talking about it that way, is, remember, you've identified that the harm was caused by their displeasure in you, and you're identifying that their displeasure in you is a response to something you did or did not do. Otherwise, you wouldn't try people pleasing. You think if you behave differently, you can make them pleased with you, and therefore they're only displeased with you because you didn't behave in the particular way necessary to please them. And it lets them off the hook. It makes it all about you, which is when people are talking about trauma, this is another thing, is to say, oh, this is my trauma response. I'm sorry, I'm being triggered. I have no choice here, which it's not that that's not true. It's, well, who's triggering you and what are they doing? Sometimes that triggers an inappropriate response, right? A response that isn't necessary or useful in the moment. And it's, you know, sometimes the reason it triggers you is because it is similar to the initial experience in some way that indicates that, yes, you should respond in that way to get through this safely. And you don't want to just lump all that there. I don't know that I don't ever have a clear message. I have a meaningful message. I'm saying things that mean things are important and are practical and can, but you could never walk away. And I feel bad about this. Like, I feel like you can't walk away from one of these things saying, so basically you're saying this, this, and this. It's like, yeah, no, not, but. You know.
No, but it creates avenues to explore other topics because it always, yeah, I always go away thinking, ooh, there's something else we can talk about. There's something else I want to ask Brandon about.
That's kind of like, if I had a central core message that I'm trying to get across, it's more complicated than that.
Yes.
No matter what you're saying, no matter how you describe it or conceptualize it, it's more complicated than that. My central message is always the way you're talking about it, the way you're thinking about it can be accurate. And there are still other ways to look at it and think about it. The way you're responding to it can be appropriate and useful and acceptable, and there can still be other ways. There's always other ways. So the metric that matters to me is not, is it healthy? Is it appropriate? Whatever. It's, you like it or not? Does it cause you problems or not? If you like it, it doesn't cause you problems. Why would we bother spending energy trying to come up with someone else? If you don't like it or it causes you problems or both, then I don't care how accurate the way you're looking at it is or how justified it is justified. It is accurate. Other people know their situation to me. If you're thinking about something of yours in some way, it's accurate. Doesn't mean it's useful. And we can always come up with other ways. There's always something else to try. That's all I'm trying to say to people. Nothing is defined and known and complete, and it is this or it is not. It's all made up, and it's useful. It's helpful. It's valid. It's real. It's based on reality. It makes things predictable to some extent. It exists for a reason, and we can still make up some more stuff if that one's not working.
Yeah, we can find other solutions if something's not working for you. There are other options to try.
Always something that can be done. Not always possible to do with the resources you have available. Not always viable, not always realistic or whatever, but there's always something else that at least theoretically could be done. So I don't ever want people to get locked into, well, I either got to do this or that's it.
For sure.
Anyway.
All right. We've gone way over time again. We're going to have to set a timer or something.
That's all right. It's fun to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. And thank you to people who've joined us in the chat. And yeah, thanks to Billy, my cat, for joining there at the end. I'm sure you can all hear that. So looking forward to seeing you again next week. Take care.
Yeah, next week, same time. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.